Hi everybody, welcome to Safe Diving, my own channel where I talk about all things scuba diving. So BCDs, or buoyancy control devices, are the jackets that scuba divers wear, and they're basically what we attach everything to. In the early days of scuba diving, they never really used BCDs. They weren't really a thing. You just had to have your weighting done correctly and strap your tank to a basic harness and a kind of backplate of sorts. And that was about it. That's all they really wore. Eventually, the BCD evolved, and the first instance seems to be from the NEDU, the American Navy sort of unit, playing about with an automatic system that will automatically adjust your buoyancy, but they actually figured that a manual inflation and deflation system might be the best. But the first BCD that you'd likely seen in the water would have been an ABLJ, which is an adjustable buoyancy life jacket. And they were a bit like the inflatable life jackets you find on an aeroplane. They kind of sit on the front, and they were often called sort of horse collars, only they had an oral inflator, similar to a modern BCD, but you could only inflate them by blowing into them. Soon they'd come with their own small tank, which the industry now calls suicide tanks, but they kind of sat around your neck, and most of the buoyancy was actually on your chest, which would be great on the surface because it would lay you in a face-up position, just like a life jacket, but it's not so great in the water, and they were a separate entity from your harness for your tank, so it all got a bit complicated. Modern BCDs have kind of combined the two, and there are hundreds of different styles and options around, and it's rare that you don't see a diver with a BCD today. Now, it can get quite complicated because us scuba divers aren't too imaginative with naming stuff, so there are quite a few terms like wing and backplate that can actually refer to multiple things, but in today's video I am going to be purely talking about recreational BCDs, and I'm going to explain each term as best I can so that you'll be more comfortable walking into a dive center and asking for exactly what you want, or at least what you need. The first thing is the style of the BCD, and it refers to kind of the shape of the bladder, the part of the BCD that actually inflates and stores the air inside. The most common style of BCD, and probably what you learnt to dive in, is called a jacket style BCD. Jacket style BCDs will inflate behind you and around your sides as well. You tend to find big lobes around your waist that have storage pockets. Jackets give you a nice big hug when you put them on, and they're pretty ergonomic too. Because they have the big lobes either side, they can attach the shoulder straps a bit further forwards instead of right at your back. The big pockets give you a storage option too, but to be brutally honest, I don't find them that easy to access because the opening is right up here. It's not that easy to actually get stuff in and out of them when you're in the water, and anything that you do manage to get into the pockets actually limits how much air and therefore buoyancy you can achieve when you inflate your BCD, and it can just get in the way of integrated weights as well, so I've never been a huge fan of them. Jackets are still pretty popular though, and will do the job just fine, but having air around your side, especially when it's fully inflated, means that it can actually squeeze your chest if you don't have the right size. And if you only have a small amount of air in the bladder, it's actually free to just roam around all around the inside of that bladder, and it can get caught in one side, so they're dropping out of popularity for wing style BCDs. Wing style BCDs will have all of their buoyancy behind you on your back. Wings tend to be much lighter in weight because they don't have the added material and bulk around the waist. They don't tend to have those big old pockets. Wings are typically in the travel section on websites, and they're usually kind of stripped down to be as light as possible. But you can find some heavy duty wings too. Wings don't have the same problem as jackets with air migrating around inside them. It all stays behind you, so they tend to hold you in a more horizontal position in the water that we call trim. This is their blessing and also their curse. If you search for wing style BCDs online, I will bet you anything that you'll soon hear someone ranting about how a wing style BCD pushes you face down on the surface. Well, I've been diving wings for at least 10 years now, and I've never had a problem with them trying to push me down and drown me on the surface. No, they will push you face down. I'm not going to lie about that, because that's what they're made to do. They're made to hold you in that trim position. But if they're doing it on the surface, it means that you just have too much air in your BCD. Just deflate it a little bit and you'll be fine. Face down on the surface isn't as much of a big deal for wings as some people let on. All you really have to do is just not carry quite as much inflation in your BCD, just enough to stay above the surface, and then just kind of lean back a little. It really has never been an issue for me. The third shape is a hybrid, and whilst there isn't a universal name or a term for them because they're kind of fairly rare. Personally, I call them butterfly wings. I don't really know why, it's just something that's stuck in my head. Others call them hybrids, but there are lots of different names out there. They're basically a jacket style BCD, but they have extra lobes either side of your tank so that when they're fully inflated, you still get that nice kind of hug of a jacket with the storage pockets that come with it. But when you're in the water and you only have a little bit of air in your BCD, this air migrates up into those lobes either side of your tank, which are now the highest point, so they hold you flat in the water and keep you in that kind of horizontal position. They're a clever solution to the problem, but they're usually a bit more expensive because of all of the extra work that actually has to go into making them, all the extra material as well. They also have extra little pockets and corners inside the bladder that can trap some air, so when you do need to dump gas, you might have to do a little bit of a shimmy to actually get that gas to move to the valve so you can get rid of it. So that's the buoyancy part of BCDs, but what about the harness that actually keeps it attached to you? You typically have shoulder straps and a waistband. That's about it. If we start at the top on a fancier BCD, you will find a softer rounded edge up around your neck so the shoulder straps don't rub against your neck or rub against your wetsuit. This is one of those underrated features that most people don't really notice until your wetsuit really starts to wear away in one particular area. The shoulder straps themselves are usually made from some kind of mesh padding on the inside with Cordura material on the outside, so you get the kind of soft on the inside and the tough on the outside. Mesh on the inside makes it a little bit softer and comfortable, especially on your shoulders, and a lot of the mesh nowadays is quite open, which makes it dry a lot faster between dives. Shoulder straps are usually ergonomic, so they curve around your shoulders, and this is where women's BCDs or women's specific BCDs start to make their real big difference, so they're a lot more comfortable for women. Sometimes in the middle of shoulder straps, you'll find a chest strap that connects the two together and basically helps to stop the shoulder straps to slip off your shoulders. That's all it's really there for. Chest straps are usually fixed, so they're exactly where they are, or they're movable, so you can move them up or down wherever it's most comfortable for you, or you can remove it altogether. It'll usually be a really simple, like 1-inch strap with a pinch clip in the middle. A pinch clip that can often have a teeny tiny whistle built into it for safety. That's a nice little point that most people don't notice. At the bottom of your shoulder straps is often a pinch clip with an adjustable section at the bottom, so you just pull on the strap to tighten it. The pinch clip itself is either just a basic straight clip, pinch it to undo it, or you can actually find hinged clips nowadays that make the strap much more ergonomic, so it's less likely to dig in anywhere. The bottom section can actually hinge around your shoulder, so it's much more ergonomic. Wing style BCDs tend to be the most forgiving for size, and they have a ton of adjustability in their shoulder straps, so if you struggle to find a BCD that normally fits you, then a wing style could be a really good option to find something that fits you more comfortably. The waistband is usually a pretty simple sort of webbing strap with a pinch clip in the middle. It'll usually double adjustment from 2-inch webbing, and sometimes you'll have a Velcro cummerbund underneath it. Cummerbunds aren't necessarily essential, but they are a nice addition. They hold your BCD around the waist, and the waistband is a pretty sort of strong backup over the top of your cummerbund. Some BCDs will have a clever system like Aqualung's Rapture system, that a bit like a hiking backpack. It puts a lot of the weight of the BCD on your waist instead of up on your shoulders, so the weight of your sort of lead in the tank doesn't ruin your back and your shoulders when you're trying to get in or out of the water. The inflator is a key part of your BCD, and most manufacturers have kind of come up with their own take on an inflator, and sometimes they even have a couple of different options throughout their range. So the real traditional style is fitted to a corrugated rubber hose that fits over your left hand shoulder and connects to the inflator, which kind of sits on your chest, and it typically has 2 buttons on it and a mouthpiece. Whilst they're often quite different shapes, colours and styles, the buttons on the end of the inflator, that's usually your dump valve, and you push that down, the air escapes through the mouthpiece. The other button, which is usually closest to the low pressure inflator hose from your regulator where that attaches, that's going to be your inflation button, so push that to inflate. So they're kind of a universal design, but that's typically how it is. There aren't really any universal inflators that sort of everyone sort of generally accepts, but the closest is what we call a K inflator, which looks like this. But that's the kind of closest thing we have to a universal inflator. But all other inflators will be similar to this with that sort of 2-button style. But the main important thing to know is that the actual sort of inlet, as it were, where it attaches onto the corrugated hose, is a different diameter for different brands, so do be careful when you're trying to replace a broken one. You can get some upgrades to your inflator as you go up through a manufacturer's range of BCDs. On the real cheap basic BCDs, their inflator will be like just a basic inflator, but then as you go up through their range, it will become something fancier. So on fancier BCDs, you'll find balanced inflator valves that will deliver a better airflow no matter your tank pressure or the depth, and some will have hinged buttons that give you a better control over how much air you put in. Instead of just a button that just blasts air in, you can just sort of finely control it if you only want a teeny tiny bit of gas. And if you want to, you can sometimes upgrade to a alternate inflator, which is basically if you blend an inflator with an octo, it's both in one unit. So you can use it to inflate your BCD. You have the inflate deflate button, but you'll also have a purge button and a mouthpiece, so you can actually breathe from it in an emergency. The only real downside to these is that you need a fancy inflator hose that usually comes with the inflator. It won't sort of take a standard sort of BCD hose because you need a higher airflow to be able to breathe from it. Actually, on that note, if you're buying a new BCD, it will come with an inflator hose. You don't have to buy that separately. Traditionally, it's fitted to the inflator in the bag or box or however you get it. All you have to do is screw the other end into your first stage. But sometimes it can be tucked into a pocket, or Aqualung, they like to tuck it in with the weight pouch. So if you can't find it, do some digging around. It's probably inside the BCD somewhere. The other style of inflator has never really taken off that well, but they're actually really nice. They're just different enough to the traditional hose over the shoulder that most divers haven't actually adopted them. They're basically a little toggle switch on your hip, and this is something like Aqualung's i3 or Mars's air trim system. These are really clever. Instead of a big clunky inflator that can slip off your shoulder and get lost, you basically have a toggle switch on your hip. You pull it up or whichever way round, and that inflates your BCD. You push it down and small cables inside the BCD open up all of the dump valves all over your BCD, so no matter what position you're in, one of the dump valves will dump some gas. If you do need to orally inflate, there's still a small tube on your left-hand shoulder that tucks away during the dive, so you can still orally inflate, but you can do everything and you just don't have that big sort of clunky hose, which is quite clever. But whilst I'm talking about the dump valves, every single BCD will have dump valves on it. The one that most people don't really notice is a lot of modern BCDs, inside that corrugated hose is a stainless steel cable which attaches the inflator to a valve on the top of your shoulder. So if you pull that inflator down without pushing any buttons or anything, just sort of pull it down, it actually opens up the valve on your left shoulder. So that's a really quick way to dump some gas, especially at the beginning of a dive. Otherwise, you'll have one or two, sometimes three maybe, sort of dump valves. The most common one will always be on your kidney. We call it a kidney dump. It's usually on the right-hand side, but sometimes you find it on the left. Left is a bit more sort of traditionalist, but a lot of modern ones, it's always on the right. There'll just be a small valve, and they'll normally be on the inside, so kind of against your back, so that way if you're swimming in an overhead environment, it's not going to get caught on anything. And it'll have a little piece of string and usually a little toggle on the end of it. It's just a spring-loaded valve. It's an overpressure valve, so if you just inflate that BCD all the way, that spring will give way so your BCD doesn't just explode, but its own overpressure valve, so it relieves that pressure. But if you give that string a tug, it'll also open that valve just to dump any gas. So the one on your kidney, that's if you're horizontal or you're sort of slightly facing downwards, you can still dump some gas. And the toggle on this one, it depends. They can be quite clever. They usually make it so that the one on your hip floats and then the one on your shoulder sinks. It's different. It's not always that way, but yeah, you'll normally have a little toggle on a piece of string, give that a tug and it'll open. And the only other one that you tend to find is over your right hand shoulder. You'll often find a piece of string that sort of runs down to your shoulder strap with a little toggle on it there. That's just another quick sort of dump if you're in a sort of upright or trim position. Just give that a tug and that should vent air out of that valve. BCDs may have integrated weight systems. You'll have quick release pouches around your waist on the front, or non-dumpable pockets on the back, and they're called trim pockets. Now you can actually find rear dumpable pouches on select BCDs. I think the only really ones are on the sort of Aqualung Rogue and the Outlaw. You can sort of dump them from behind you, but more often than not, they're usually on the front. If we start with the dumpable pouches first, you'll have two small pouches, one on either side, that you fill with lead that fit in either side of your waist. Each pouch will have a maximum weight limit, which is usually around 4 or 5 kilos of lead in each pouch, on each side, but it'll be written somewhere on the pouch sort of how much lead you can put in there safely. The pouch will have a quick release mechanism that clicks into place, and they'll either have a simple pinch clip or a handle release, but there are lots of different mechanisms out there. If you tug on anything, if you just grab hold of the pocket itself and try and yank that out, the pouch won't move at all. But if you tug on the handle, it's going to activate a mechanism that opens up so that you can throw that lead away easily in one smooth motion. The downside to these is that if you do need to ditch some lead, you do lose the pouch with it too, and you do have to buy a brand new pouch. They also have ever-changing mechanisms, so check any replacements will fit your BCD before actually buying them. And if you don't use the mechanisms right, then you can actually quite easily lose a pouch. Just because it's in the right kind of position doesn't mean that it's actually the pouches or the mechanism is actually activated. Mares actually have a color-coded system that physically tell you the pouch is fitted correctly. Another mechanism is often called the gravity mechanism. There are two different ways of doing this. The first one is a pouch has a zipper on the top, and that's kind of fitted to the BCD, and then at the bottom, or kind of on the side, it has a pinch clip. If you're in trouble and you need to ditch some lead, then of course the lead that you put in through the zipper, you undo that pinch clip, and then the lead, because it's heavy, naturally just kind of falls out because the bottom opens up, the lead falls out, you don't lose any kind of pouches or anything. Ziegel have a slightly different way, which is quite clever, and basically thread a cable through your BCD attached onto a handle so that it's kind of stitching the bottom of the like weight pockets together, but then if you need to, grab hold of that handle and that undoes that single sort of thread, and the bottom just opens up and your lead just disappears. So it's quick and effective, but you don't have to lose any pouches. The downside is that you often can't take a pouch out and sort of hand that up to the boat handler. It's just kind of loose blocks of lead. So your BCD is still super heavy when you have to hand it up to someone, but in the kind of idea of safety and not losing equipment, it's kind of a good idea. Trim weight pouches give you the option to move some of your lead around, so you don't have it all on your front, on your waist, but trim weight pockets or pouches, they usually sit on your back either side of your tank. So they're either built into the back of the BCD themselves with just like a pinch clip velcro kind of closure, or they're actually on the cam band itself, literally on the tank. So these are described as non-dumpable, because you physically can't really reach them to get rid of them in an emergency. So they're not usually particularly large because you don't want to put too much lead there that you can't get rid of. You can only usually fit 1, maybe 2 kilos on each, so kind of 4 maybe in total. If your BCD doesn't have these, then it's actually not the end of the world. You can always fit lead blocks sort of onto the 2-inch cam band around your tank. You can just thread it through the lead just like a weight belt, but then it's definitely not dumpable, but it does give you that option if you do need to add like an extra kilo or 2. The backplate of a BCD is usually made from plastic and is what your tank physically attaches to. They range from nothing at all, just a bit of fabric on lightweight travel BCDs, just a kind of soft piece of mesh padding that makes your BCD really easy to literally wrap up and pack away into really small spaces, all the way up to like a hinging backplate that folds in half, again for easier packaging, so it's not so much of a big item, and then you can find sort of full plastic backplates with a section of padding over the top for comfort. Backplates usually have a handle right at the top so you can carry your BCD around when it's attached onto a tank, and of course they have mesh padding on them so they're much more comfortable. On the other side, kind of on the back where your tank attaches, you'll have a concave mount that cradles your tank that usually has rubber stoppers on it somewhere to help stop that tank from slipping around. The cam band will run through the backplate, and at the top you'll often find a leash as well, which is just a thin section of webbing that just goes around the tank valve and acts as a backup to the cam band. If that ever fails for whatever reason, at least you've got something else holding on to the tank. Storage pockets on BCDs are on either waist traditionally. They're either Velcro closure with a flap on the top, or they can be a zipper closure along the top, or you can find some with a drop down pocket. A small roll up pocket that just kind of sits out of the way until you need it. Drop down pockets are more of an emergency, but they're kind of nice to have if you need it. All you really need to do is undo a little Velcro strap and that kind of pocket unfurls, and yeah, you've got a nice neat little pocket that usually has its own like zippered closure, but if you don't need it, then you can roll it up and yeah, it's nice and neat and out of the way. Now, as I said earlier, I've never really been a huge fan of pockets on BCDs themselves because I don't really find them that easy to reach. If you have pockets on a jacket style BCD, then anything that you do put into your pockets is pushed against your weight pouches, so it can get quite crowded in there, and if you inflate your BCD all the way, it takes up some space, so your BCD won't fill up all the way. So that's why Mares came up with stretchy pockets. So these are an external material that kind of stretches to the shape of whatever you have in the pocket, so it doesn't take up any buoyancy room, and it can sort of get out of the way of your weight pockets, which is a real smart sort of way of getting around that problem. But yeah, for me, for storage, I just tend to use thigh pockets instead of any kind of pockets up around my waist, just because I find them much easier to access. On some BCDs, you'll find small holes a few inches apart on the waist, usually around a pocket. These are for a dive knife. On some dive knives, you'll have bolts that will line up with these holes so that you can bolt your dive knife onto your BCD on your waist instead of strapping it to your leg or wherever else you want to put your dive knife. The distance between these two holes, the grommets, isn't universal, however, across all manufacturers, so it's best to stick to the same brand if you can, or at least measure the distance properly before you try mixing brands and try and fit a Scuba Pro knife onto an Oceanic BCD, because they don't always line up. You can get lucky, but I can't promise you that. BCDs are typically made from Cordura type material, which has different grades. Basically, the bigger the number, the tougher the material. So a 2000D will be much tougher material than a 1000D. But it also makes the material itself heavier. So BCDs designed for travel will have a lighter material, so it's a lot lighter to carry and it doesn't sort of use up all your baggage allowance, but it won't put up with as much abuse and abrasion. If you rub up against something sharp, there's a higher chance that it will rip. You'll also find coated material that has a smooth exterior. This has quite a few benefits, but it's heavier still because of that extra coating. But the main benefit is that nothing can actually soak into the material. If you dive in particularly hazardous water, then no nasties will physically soak into the material. But they also let them dry almost as soon as you leave the water. Because it's practically hydrophobic, the water just sheds off of it. You can also even find coated webbing if you're diving in terrible conditions, but again, it's heavier and more expensive. The newest material to come out comes from Scuba Pro's Hydros series. They're actually using the monoprene from their fins, and this has a few benefits. The main one is that it dries instantly, so as soon as you get out, you don't have to worry about sort of leaving it to drip dry quite as long, because the harness and the backplate just dry instantaneous. It's quite strong, so you don't have to worry about sort of wear and tear. Of course, you do have to worry about wear and tear, but you don't have to worry sort of quite as much. The material itself also has a little bit of grip when it's a little bit wet, so that can help stop the BCD from kind of moving around on you. It kind of holds onto you. But yeah, the main downside is that it kind of has to be modular, because you can't stitch the monoprene material. It will just sort of rip. But if you're looking for lightweight for travel, then of course you want the lightest Cordura, the smallest number, so it's nice and light. But if you want something really tough, then of course you want the biggest number, so it's really tough and sort of heavy duty. The sort of the monoprenes and the coated, yeah, they're obviously much more heavier than their just sort of standard nylon Cordura alternatives. Apart from pockets and pouches, divers use D-rings to store items and clip things off onto them so that they don't lose them and they don't have to hold on to things constantly. So D-rings are traditionally on either shoulder, and these will be pre-bent D-rings, so the bottom of the D-ring sits a little bit away from your shoulder strap just to make it a bit easier to clip things off onto it. Traditionally, you'll only have one D-ring on either shoulder, so two on in total, but you can find more. Personally, I find anything more than one D-ring on either shoulder strap is a little bit excessive, but you can find two on both. But I only tend to use one of them. You can sometimes find a smaller D-ring on sort of one corner, on sort of one section of the shoulder strap. It's for anything really, but personally I'd put a clip and SPG to it, so it's nice and close to your chest. Some people put an octo to it. It's slightly unconventional, but you can use it for whatever you want really. Then when you sort of start to move down to your waist, you'll just find D-rings all over the place, but they'll usually be straight D-rings instead of being pre-bent. Because they're more open to kind of flapping around, they're a bit easier to clip off onto, so they don't have to be bent. At the top of the BCD or over the sort of pockets, these are often for a octo clip or your gauges if you're clipping them off onto it, so they're a bit easier to see and a bit easier to clip off onto it. Whilst we're actually talking about octos and gauges, a lot of BCDs at the pockets, they'll often have this kind of cutout section. For the octo, it's meant so that you can just bend the hose in two and then feed the hose into that. That way your octo is still in that triangle, it's still quick release, but you don't need an actual clip. For your gauges, they're normally a little bit wider, so you can just feed the gauge up through behind the pocket and up through that hole. It means that again you don't need a clip. It means that your hose is sort of nice and tucked away, so it's not going to get caught on anything, and your gauges are always exactly where you want them to be. Moving down to the bottom of the BCD, looking for D-rings. D-rings at the bottom of the BCD, these are usually for storage, to clip things off onto it. So like a reel or a spool, just something that you want out of the way, you can clip things off onto that. And then these D-rings, the ones at the front of your BCD, these are actually made to get the right fit of your BCD, so you can kind of pull them to make sure it's like nice and comfortable and in the right position. And they also give you something to like pull against when you're putting your weight pouch to like really push that into position. It just gives you something to pull against. You'll also find D-rings on the ends of some of the adjustable straps, but these are just to give you something to physically put your thumb through and just to pull on. They're not actually meant to clip things off onto them, because when your straps are done up, that D-ring is going to be sort of a bit too far away from your body, and anything that you clip off onto it is just going to drag along the bottom, get caught on things and just damage stuff. So don't really use them to clip things off onto. The D-rings themselves, they'll be traditionally made out of, or they'll be 2 inches wide, and they'll be steel D-rings, but to save some weight they can often become aluminium and even plastic if you're on like a real lightweight BCD. So heavyweight BCDs, they'll be steel because they're nice and strong. In an effort to save a few grams, then they'll become aluminium, and then to be as lightweight as possible, they'll just become plastic. But of course, plastic is a bit more fragile and sort of more likely to sort of break instead of just bending. Sometimes you can even find smaller 1 inch wide D-rings. That's much smaller. It's harder to clip off onto, but they're usually, again, made to save weight. So they're on travel BCDs where you're going to have bare hands, so it's easy to clip things off onto it. Side mount BCDs are purely specialist equipment. You can't just dive any old BCD and just clip side mount tanks onto it. Side mounts require something sort of particular. You need D-rings in key areas, and recreational BCDs just aren't set up for side mounted tanks. They just don't have the D-rings in the right place. Side mount BCDs will do side mount really, really well, but nothing else. You can't mount a single tank in the center on the back of them. You certainly can't mount twins to the back of them because they usually have a wraparound bladder, so nowhere to actually fit a cam band down the center. But how they differ from a recreational BCD is that your weight system is traditionally located down your spine, so you can place your lead nice and close to you, and you can move it as far up or as far down your spine as you need it. Your inflator will typically come underneath your left arm instead of over your shoulder, and it's going to clip to your chest instead of being a bit more free floating. And most of your buoyancy is kind of in the small of your back, so it's a very different animal. there's a lot more to be said about side mount BCDs. I'm only mentioning them here just so that if you're thinking about moving on to side mount, you don't just buy a jacket style BCD and think that will be okay. The cam band on the back of your BCD is what attaches your tank to your BCD. It's called a cam band. They'll be 2 inches wide and they will have a clamp buckle of some sorts. The cheapest and lightest are made from plastic, but after a while and a lot of use, these of course can fracture. A tougher alternative is metal, which is much stronger, but of course it's a little bit heavier. An upgraded version will be a 2-part mechanism, which is quite clever. This means that you have so less threading to do. You don't have to thread through the buckle. It's much easier just to kind of attach a loop over the clamp and then clamp that down. And you also don't have that annoying extra bit of strap that can kind of flap around behind you. It's all kind of tucked away. It's all nice and neat. And the last type of cam band are pretty new and they're a bit like snowboard bindings. They'll have kind of like a ratchet strap that tightens around the tank to kind of like finger tight, and then you have a lever that really clamps it down nice and tight. At one point there were also some pneumatic cam bands on very few BCDs where it would basically connect to your regulator. Realistically it was a BCD with a built-in regulator, so it would it would pneumatically seal your cam band in place, so there was no way your cam band can undo or slip unless you wanted it to. A new feature that's cropping up in a few modern BCDs is modular parts. So most recreational BCDs are built as just a single item, so everything's stitched together, and if something rips or if something tears, it may not be able to be fixed, so you may have to write off the entire BCD if you rip a shoulder strap. Modular BCDs mean that you may be able to replace just that part if it breaks. On standard BCDs you'll get a standard small, medium and large kind of sizes, but on some modular BCDs like the Outlaw and the Rogue from Aqualung, each part can be a different size. So if you're an unusual shape, you can have a large backplate, a medium shoulder strap, a small waistband, and literally make a BCD that fits you comfortably instead of suffering. So if you're really tall and thin, you don't have to go for the extra large BCD that has so much sort of extra space just because you need that long back plate. You can literally just get a long back plate and then small shoulder straps. On recreational BCDs, the lift doesn't really matter, to be honest. They should all manage a single 12-litre tank with absolutely zero problems, and they'll all probably take a 15-litre too. If in doubt, every single BCD will have a little yellow or white tab on it somewhere with the BCD serial number kind of stamped into it, and on that it will have a little diagram with the largest cylinder that you should be able to dive with it. It's all subjective though. It's based on your buoyancy and the amount of lead that you wear, but at the recreational level, I wouldn't worry about the amount of lift a certain BCD gives you unless you really plan on carrying a lot of heavy gear or just way too much lead. It should have plenty of lift for you. I mentioned these a little bit earlier. These are really rare nowadays. And they're actually a little bit worrying as a professional diver. So you had, I think Mara's did one which was quite nice. It was the Mara's hub, and that was made by divers for divers. But you can find some that they're not made by big diving brands, and there's kind of a reason. They're basically a BCD with a regulator built into them as like a single unit that you just strap a tank onto the back, but they're fairly basic, and they're really mainly sold for boat owners as something that they can just throw on to sort of check the underside of their boat or sort of clear a fouled propeller. But yeah, they're kind of sold as if you don't need any kind of training, and yeah, you can just go scuba diving with this, just fit a small tank onto it and you'll be fine, unless you get caught underwater. So these do exist, but I don't recommend them at all. And that's pretty much it for BCDs, at least recreational BCDs, that is. If you're planning on diving twin cylinders or side mounts, as I said earlier, then you will need something a bit more substantial. Some BCDs can definitely handle twin cylinders, and some can even have twins bolted onto them, or have something called a BIBO kit fitted so that you can strap two independent tanks to the back of them. But I've never been a huge fan of them. They just have too much give, and they don't have the rigidity of a sort of backplate system. If personally, if you're asking me, if you want to dive twins or side mount, then you should really do it properly. It's like trying to use a standard hatchback to do some proper farm work. It'll do it, but not very well. For twins, I'd recommend a backplate and harness, and for side mount, then yeah, a side mount harness, because it will do the job perfectly. And I can promise you now that there is no single BCD that will do singles, side mount and twins. It doesn't exist. It's a unicorn. There's no such thing. The closest thing that you'll get is a backplate and harness system. And then if you have your heart set on side mounts, realistically just invest in a side mount BCD. But what BCD do you use, or what BCD do you have your eye on? What was your very first BCD? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget that I have a Teespring shop if you want any safe diving clothing. I tend to try and keep it fairly simple in the designs, and if you have any designs that you'd like to see, then let me know, and I'll see what I can draw up. Thank you for watching, and safe diving.